You're listening to the Literary Atlanta podcast. I'm Allison Law. As promised in the last episode, The Bitter Southerner released its annual summer reading roundup this past week. Thank you, Kyle Tibbs Jones and Chuck Reese of The Bitter Southerner, for inviting me for the second year in a row to work with you on the list. The list from The Bitter Southerner represents 18 titles, some of the best fiction and nonfiction recently published or soon to publish by or about people living in the southern region of the United States. There truly is something for every reading taste on the list. You'll find histories of barbecue and home cooking, novels about lives torn apart by an unfair justice system, deeper examinations into the lesser-known passion projects of Harper Lee and Frederick Law Olmsted, historical fiction about women keeping secrets and finding power through resistance, and a weighty memoir about the physical manifestation of pain and oppression. So many great books here. It was very hard to pick just 18, but somehow Kyle and Chuck helped me limit my pages long list to the 18 titles we selected. Please visit the Bitter Southerner website to view their beautiful presentation of the 2019 Summer Reading Roundup. If you've read one of these books or decide to add it to your beach bag or TBR pile, please share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtags Literary Atlanta, Bitter Southerner, Summer Reading Roundup, that's a really long one, and Read More Books, hashtag Summer Reading Roundup. The author of one of those Southern summer reads visited Atlanta this past Monday. I was honored to interview Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and best-selling author Tony Horwitz about his new book, Spying on the South. A crowd of more than 100 people joined us at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, and we also had a crew recording the conversation for C-SPAN's Book TV. That episode should be available on air and online in the next couple of weeks. And in an act of literary synchronicity, as I was preparing for my interview with Tony Horwitz and reconsidering his book, Confederates in the Attic, I was also reading a novel set in the early 90s in Virginia. At that time, the Walt Disney Company had announced plans to open a Civil War theme park just next to the Manassas battlefield. Horwitz wrote about the controversy in Confederates in the Attic, which was published in 1998, and almost 20 years later, the Disney's America theme park stirred the imagination of fiction writer Michael Knight. It serves as the newsy backdrop for a rich story that explores history and the inner workings of teenage girls enrolled at an all-girls boarding school. My recorded conversation with Michael Knight about his latest novel, At Briarwood School for Girls, is next on episode 59 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. At Briarwood School for Girls is Michael Knight's third published novel. His first novel, Divining Rod, won the Fellowship of Southern Writers New Writing Award and the Dictionary of Literary Biography's Best First Novel Award. The Typist was selected as a Best Book of the Year by the Huffington Post and the Kansas City Star, among other publications. It appeared on Oprah's Summer Reading List in 2011. Michael Knight has also released 3 short story collections, Evening Land, Goodnight Nobody, and Dogfight and Other Stories, and the book of novellas, The Holiday Season. His short stories have appeared in magazines and journals like The New Yorker, Oxford American, Paris Review, and the Southern Review, and have been anthologized in Best American Mystery Stories and New Stories from the South. Michael teaches creative writing at the University of Tennessee and lives in Knoxville with his family. Most importantly, Michael is a repeat guest of Writers at the Wrecking Bar. He made his first author appearance in April 2017 with his collection of linked short stories, Evening Land, and he made his second Writers at the Wrecking Bar appearance in May of 2019 with me. So we began our talk at Wrecking Bar by looking at Briarwood School for Girls epigraph. The epigraph in the beginning of the book quotes from 2 different texts.
One of them is a real source, and the other is fictitious.
Yeah.
So I thought that we could start our conversation by having you read the quote from the first source and maybe talk about how Disney factors into the narrative.
So, okay, here's the epigraph. This is from an internal memo that Michael Eisner sent out to a bunch of Disney employees. And it goes like this. We have no obligation to make history. We have no obligation to make art. We have no obligation to make a statement. To make money is our only object. And so maybe I should set the book up a little bit and talk about how. So Briarwood School for Girls is set in 1994 at an fictional all-girls boarding school in Prince William County, Virginia. And it's mostly focused on the sort of personal dramas of a handful of students and teachers and coaches and administrators and alumni factors into the book. But all those personal dramas are set against the backdrop of a thing that actually did happen. In 1993, Disney Company announced its plans and began making plans to build a history-themed amusement park, what the book calls a technicolor simulacrum of American history, right in the middle of one of the most history-rich regions of the country. It's hard to imagine it now. They were going to put the park almost adjacent to Manassas Battlefield. And in the book, the boarding school is very close to where they were going to put the park. So I hope what happens in the book is that the looming possibility of this park getting built casts a kind of shadow over the personal dramas and creates a pressure on the people who are living in this place. Because, if this park goes up, the region is going to be changed forever, for better or for worse. A lot of people in Prince William County wanted the park. It was going to generate a ton of jobs and a ton of revenue. And it also allows me, I hope, to sort of lift up above the personal dramas and talk about some bigger picture ideas about history and about authenticity. And even about, it seems like such a simple thing, but about happiness, what happiness means. Disney used to bill itself back in those days as the happiest place on earth. And what does that even mean in the life of a 16-year-old girl who's pregnant? How does she define happiness versus the kind of artificial, pretty, but surface pretty happiness that, Disney generates? Did that kind of answer what you're
Yeah. The interesting thing to me about this was when I started reading the book, I was like, I vaguely recall that there was this Disney's America that was in the... And fortunately, we have another author event coming up in a couple of weeks with Tony Horwitz, who wrote Confederates in the Attic. And are you all familiar with Confederates in the Attic? Have you read that book? Well, I studied it when I was in graduate school, and so I went back to it, and he talks about it in his introduction, and then he devotes an entire chapter to Virginia and what he calls the Civil War-gasm, and talks about the two battles in Manassas and how things were about to be Disney-fied, but thankfully it didn't quite happen. So I wondered if you were familiar with that text and what research you called upon.
I know the book, but I have not read it. I mean, I remember when it came out, it was a huge deal. But so the Washington Post was very anti this project, and so there's tons of archival articles that I drew on from the Washington Post. I read Michael Eisner's memoir and a couple of books about Michael Eisner, and funnily enough, maybe this is not surprising, but there are hundreds of websites written by Disney heads, all of whom, thought this was the greatest idea of all times and thought Disney got a raw deal by, eventually Disney got kind of run out of the area. But so there are tons of websites where these people who are totally invested in Disney are sort of railing against or railing in favor of the project and were incensed that it didn't happen. So those were great sources of material. This was a very sort of interesting time to me. Well, okay, so I said the book concerns itself with history, and this is an old idea. It's not an original idea, but one of the sort of premises of the book is that we're defined by our history, right? But both on a personal level, like our individual history, on a community level. Boarding school is a very insulated sort of community, and so there's this kind of repeated history that generations of young women experience at this boarding school, and also like national history. And how we're defined by our understanding of each of those levels of history, personal, community, and national levels. And the reason Disney was such an interesting backdrop for those ideas was, so this was in 1994, which strikes me now as a time right before we started thinking and talking differently about some ideas in the United States, ideas about gender, ideas about race, and some of the rides that Disney proposed for this park. They would never in a million years propose such rides today. You know, there was the one that gets the most airtime in the novel is, so they invented this virtual reality technology. It was cutting edge in 1993, and this language was taken from Disney's promotional material at the time. And I'm going to have to paraphrase because I don't have the page in front of me, but it was something like, using cutting-edge technology, Disney Imagineers have created an underground railroad experience so revolutionary that it will really make you feel what it was like to be a slave. Can you imagine anyone thinking that way? But so this, I wasn't thinking about this when I started writing the book, but it struck me that this was like a moment right before people began to think and talk differently about certain things that are, still important and still being talked about and debated all the time today.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that you do in the book is, preceding different sections, you have quiz questions with multiple choice answers, some of them pertaining to Disney's America and others pertaining to the play, which is the other part, the fictionalized part of it. So I was curious which answers, selections, like that Underground Railroad ride, which parts were accurate and which were imagined.
So each section of the book, instead of having just part one and part two, there's a multiple choice question for each section of the book, and some of them pertain to the Disney plot and some pertain to these more personal dramas. So the only ones that are imagined are the ones that pertain to the personal dramas. The financial stuff about the revenue that Disney would have generated, that's all available online, and the rides that Disney proposed are all available online. That's all real. So I think the answers to both of those questions are all of the above.
Yeah. It's pretty good if you've gone through any of the SAT training. It's like, it's probably all of the above. If you don't know the answer, pick all of the above. But
that was one of those things. I don't know. You guys will have to say whether or not it works in the context of the novel. But you're always looking for interesting and original ways to tell a story. And especially to deal with backstory, to get in like big chunks of information into a text that doesn't just drag down the action of a chapter, and experimenting with those multiple choice questions. So suddenly the reader has this information going forward without quite realizing that they've gathered the information, was the hope. And also it connected, in my mind at least, to notions about history and what can we actually know with 100% certainty about a particular historical event, both on a large scale level, but also in terms of, there are some of the questions are about the characters' biographies, and I don't want to give anything away, but so there are some that aren't answered in the book, that the book doesn't answer the question. So one of these choices is the real answer to the thing, but does it matter if can we know a person if we don't know every detail of their history, or does it matter if can we still understand this character if we don't know this particular detail, detail of the plot? So that was interesting to me to think about anyway in the writing.
Right. So let's move on to the second half of the epigraph, which is from a fictional play. And when I started reading the book, I went and searched to see if it was an actual play or a fictional play. And what I found was that the closest thing I found was one in the Nancy Drew series, The Ghost of Thornton Hall. Did you know that Nancy Drew?
No, I had no idea. Is there really a Nancy Drew novel called The Ghost of Thornton Hall?
Yes.
I promise you I have no idea.
I didn't know if you were inspired by Nancy Drew, but there is a Ghost of Thornton Hall.
There were certainly Nancy Drew novels in my house when I was a kid. My sister loved them, so maybe I saw that cover and
that's because your parents
stuck in my
raised you right.
subconscious
That's why.
somewhere. Yeah.
So anyhow, I went and looked it up. So can you tell us about the Phantom of Thornton Hall and how that relates to your story?
So in the novel, the drama club has decided, they've been given permission to put on a play which is written by one of the school's most famous alumni, who's a kind of a Harper Lee figure. She won the Pulitzer Prize back in the 60s. Her name is Eugenia Marsh. And now she's become a recluse. She hasn't had any success since then, and she's become kind of a recluse. So one, it was just fun to kind of create a fictional Harper Lee sort of character. In the play, she tells the story of her own experience as a young woman at Briarwood School for Girls, in which she had a run-in with the ghost of a woman named Elizabeth Archer, who, according to campus legend, Elizabeth Archer hanged herself in Thornton Hall after finding out about her fiance's death during World War I. And she's sort of the legendary ghost of the campus. So one of the protagonists of the novel, a young woman named Lenore Littlefield. This is sounding more and more convoluted as I'm explaining it, but I promise it's fairly straightforward in the text. As a kind of punishment, she's late for curfew one night, and as a kind of punishment, she's forced to join the drama club. And they're putting on this play. So in the present time, Lenore is having an experience. She's pregnant. She's a junior in high school. She's having an experience that mirrors, in a way that's too close for comfort, the experience that she's performing in the play. And going back to these sort of bigger ideas that shadow over the novel, one of the things that I found interesting about writing those elements of the story were connecting notions about authenticity, like which is the real self? Is it the one who's afraid and pregnant and doesn't know who to turn to? Is it the one who's confident and has friends? Is it the one who's performing on stage? But also this connecting, again, to this notion of history repeating itself and this same set of events playing out in this little isolated community over time. And the play sort of helped dovetail a lot of the big ideas that were hovering over the book.
Mm-hmm. And we meet so many different characters at Briarwood who have been connected to the school. They were students at the school, and now they're like Coach Fink, who has taken over the school play. Right. She was a student there. The headmistress, Augusta Mackey, was a student there. Why did you decide to set the story at a girls' boarding school in Virginia?
It didn't start off that way. So I'm going to take a long route to that answer. Is that okay? Can I take a slightly longer route? So I grew up in South Alabama, but and almost all of my fiction has been set in or around Mobile Bay, where I grew up. But I went to college in Virginia, and I went to graduate school in Virginia, and I taught at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia for a while. I met my wife and married my wife in Virginia, and just for a long time I've wanted to write a Virginia book. And, a book that sort of, investigated and did justice to my memories of that place. And because most of my experience in the state was academic, I thought, well, I'll set it on a campus somewhere, and I'll do a kind of academic comedy. I guess I was imagining, have you guys ever read Lucky Jim? Do you know that old Kingsley Amis novel? It's one of the funniest books ever written, yeah. I was kind of imagining something like that, but it was awful. Like the first chapters out of the gate were, on the best pages it was mildly amusing, but it was utterly without substance. And so I would put it away for a while and then come back to it. And just on a lark, I moved it to a boarding school. I didn't go to boarding school. I reset it on the campus of a boarding school. And a couple of really strange things happened. It seemed to me right away the stakes were raised, that the problems that the students had were immediately more dramatic when a 16-year-old young woman was confronting this problem versus when a 20 or 21-year-old young woman was confronting this particular problem. But the thing that surprised me the most was how, at least in my conception of the characters, the responsibility that they owed to their charges at the school was greater. It was, I love and feel responsible for my students at the University of Tennessee, but I don't want to get involved in their personal lives, unless it's an emergency. There's lucky, a number that I'm supposed to call when that happens. But in this case, I felt like the teachers and the coaches, they instantly had more responsibility for their students. And so when they made bad decisions, and they make plenty of bad decisions, the risk of consequence was greater to setting it on the campus of a boarding school. And I've always, I don't know if you're this way, but I've always loved boarding school novels. The Catcher in the Rye and Prime of Miss Jean Brodie.
Separate Peace, John Knowles.
Oh, yeah. Separate Peace for sure. That's one of the classics. And I've been thinking a lot, in the writing of this book and talking about this book about why I was drawn to boarding school novels, when I was young. And I think part of the reason is, so a boarding school is often an incredibly sheltered place. It's sheltered by privilege, it's sheltered by tradition, it's sheltered by geography in a lot of cases. And so there's this sense that you have all these young people with more freedom probably than they need, but also this sense, so they can get themselves into plenty of trouble, but also this sense that because of that, the sheltered nature of the place, that they're guaranteed a soft landing, which is not true at all. They're subject to all the consequences that the rest of us are subject to. But so they tend sometimes, I think, to make decisions that get them into trouble that maybe could be avoided in another circumstance. But I think that combination of too much freedom with the illusion of a soft landing was intriguing to me.
Yeah. Do you think that that's why Poppy Tuttle feels free to be so outspoken and voice her displeasure with Disney moving into Virginia?
So Poppy is one of Lenore's good friends, and Poppy is one of the funnier characters in the book, and certainly one of the most outspoken. And she's agitating against Disney from the very beginning with a profane button that she wears around campus. But yeah, I mean, I think I also think Poppy wants to get kicked out of school. Poppy wants to get out from under the umbrella of this sort of perfectly sheltered environment, and so she keeps doing things sort of at least subconsciously in an effort to get herself thrown out and to have to live a life that feels more real to her than the life that she's living at the boarding school.
Yeah, I like the pin, and I like Poppy a lot. She's fun.
I like Poppy too.
You have mentioned several times, and throughout the book, various characters shared their perspectives on history and the role of history as it relates to change and modern times. And you have a character in the book, Lucas Bishop, who is a history teacher who takes the students on the annual field trip to the Manassas battlefield. And yet he gets in trouble because the headmistress thinks that he should be teaching the Civil War, based on the events that happened back then and not relating it to whether or not there should be a theme park just down the road. What do you what were you trying to explore there in terms of history and how it relates? Can it coincide with progress?
Yes, I mean, I think it has to coincide with progress. I don't think we ever make a lot of progress unless we have something as close as we can come to a genuine understanding of our history, which was the thing that people worried about with Disney, that it would be a sort of whitewashed, Disneyfied version of American history as opposed to a version of American history that represented something like the truth, which is how I think Bishop feels. He gets in trouble because he wants to talk about this in class and debate with the students and ask them what they think of the park. And I think he feels that way. Unfortunately, in the novel, he's not really strong enough to press the point. And I think that's where Bishop gets into trouble. He's a weaker character. But yeah, I think Bishop would say, and does say essentially in the book, that if we don't know, and I think lots of other people have said this before, that if we don't know honestly our history, then you can't make good decisions in the present.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that as a teacher, you think it's a good tool to compare what happened back then to what's happening now and see what are the differences, what are the things that haven't changed.
Yeah, I'm teaching creative writing, not history, but we start with Anton Chekhov, and then we usually end with 2 or 3 stories that were written in the last couple of years. We ended this year with Cat Person. Did you remember that?
Yeah,
that story that went viral. So we started with Chekhov.
She was here at the Wrecking Bar.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
that would have been a lot of fun.
Kristen Rupinian.
So we started with Chekhov's Lady with a Pet Dog, which is about a sort of misogynist. He's a womanizer, and he kind of he's changed in the course of the book, and ended with another bad romance story, which was, when was that? Just last year, I guess it was published in the New Yorker. So yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting is the fundamental way in which a story gets told between 1892 and 2018 hasn't changed a ton. You know what I mean? A story is a story is a story, and there's interesting characters, and there's got to be conflict on interior and exterior levels. But to watch the machinery of how the writers make those very basic, very core things happen between 1892 and 2018 is really interesting. It's interesting to me. The students are probably bored out of their minds when we're talking about it, but it's interesting to me to look at it.
Well, as long as you're having a good time.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's I like to amuse myself in class.
I know. That's how I felt when I was teaching freshman comp sometimes. Like, at least I why don't you love this? This is amazing. But, oh well. The other element to this is kind of a supernatural thing, and how we communicate, not only communicate with our past, but communicate with the ghosts that are inherent with, past events. You talk about how you wrote about the phantom and the events that seem to kind of be repeating themselves at the school.
Well, that was the big question, and it was something that I debated throughout the writing, was whether or not, so there's this legend of this ghost, right? And the ghost does not make an appearance until late in the novel. And so the question of whether or not the ghost is real hovers over the first, 15 or 20 chapters. And I debated for a long time about whether the ghost should be real or not. But it seemed to me that given this conversation that we're having about history, and given some of what's in the book about history, that eventually the past had to make an actual arrival into the present. Otherwise, it would just be theory. It would just be characters having a conversation about history and, oh, look, that happened in the past. But when, in this case, we get an actual manifestation of the past in the present via the telephone. The ghost calls on the dorm telephone line to talk to Lenore. So, yeah, that was my thinking with the ghost. And this is, one of the sort of interesting things about this book has been the reader response to the ghost. There are two sets of, I think, readers. One set says, this is not the ghost story that I expected. This ghost is not at all scary. I expected it to be gothic and the ghost to come and do terrible things. But this is, so if that's the kind of ghost story that you like to read, this is the wrong book for you. But if you like a ghost who's funny and still thinks of herself as a 16-year-old girl living in a dorm at Briarwood at an all-girls boarding school, then maybe you'll like it.
Yeah, I like that. It reminds me of the letter that Flannery O'Connor received after A Good Man was published, and someone said, it is all a metaphor. None of that really happened, right? And she was like, oh, you need some help. But
someone asked me at an event last week if it was really the ghost calling or if it was another character. And I was like, no, it's the ghost calling. There's no evidence to indicate in the book that it's another character.
She shows up on caller ID.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, did they have caller ID in 94?
I don't think so.
They had call waiting.
Not on dorm phones, not in... Yeah.
But that was one of the other things that I enjoyed about the book, too, because I was in college in 94, so it was, listening to your Walkman and, to REM, and it was a little nostalgic for me. But these kids are dealing, as you mentioned before, with some pretty tough issues, teen pregnancy and suicide. And how do you deal with that in a delicate and in a delicate way and true to what these girls were certainly going through in that environment?
Well, I think the second part of that is the part that is most important to me. If it comes out delicately, then that's great. But I think most importantly, you want to do justice to the characters and you want to be honest about the things that they're going through. I worried a little bit about writing it's third person, but writing from the point of view of a 16-year-old young woman character, and not even the scenes that aren't dealing with these more dramatic subjects. And what I found was that whenever I tried to sit down and write something and thought to myself, what would a 16-year-old girl think? The chapter was terrible. But whenever I just sort of said, okay, what would Lenore Littlefield think? This character who lives in my brain and is, as much Michael Knight as she is anything else, then the work was better. So when I stayed on that track, I could write more honestly about what Lenore's going through. When I could be more honest to her character when I didn't worry so much about, am I doing justice to being 16? Am I doing justice to being a woman? When I just tried to do justice to the character who was in my imagination, that it was easier it wasn't easy, but it was possible to get up close to her.
Well, that's a good writing tip. Be as specific as possible, and that helps you.
For sure.
I know that you wanted to share a portion of the book in the middle section. So do you want to set it up for us and then read a little for us?
Well, now that we've been talking, I might call an audible and read a different section, but I have to ask a question first. What's the rating of your podcast?
The rating of my
PG-13.
podcast?
Can we go PG-13? Full PG-13?
Yeah.
We're not going to go R, but can we go PG-13?
Well, they don't have that. We just have it for podcast. It's E for explicit.
Oh, so. Well, we're not. This is not explicit, but there's a B word in here, and I think an SH.
Go for
word.
it.
So you said you like Poppy, so I thought maybe I would do a Poppy Tuttle section.
Good.
So let's see if I can I walk over in the light a little bit? Yeah. So Poppy Tuttle is is friends with one of our protagonists, Lenore Littlefield. And like I said before, Poppy has been agitating against Disney from the very beginning of the book. In the section that I'm going to read, right before this section, Poppy has done something at a school assembly that has gotten her into a lot of trouble. Disney has sent a representative to talk to the students about how great the park is going to be and how the park is going to change the region for the better. And Poppy causes a commotion. We're going to pick up right after that. And I think the only other thing you need to know about this section is that Lenore is a third generation. It's mentioned in this section that she's a third generation Briarwood student. Down with Disney, the sign had read, a slogan so obvious it failed to impress Lenore. The disciplinary committee was scheduled to meet on Friday, an expedited hearing, and when Lenore let herself imagine how the hearing might play out, a lump of fearful anger bellied up in her throat. Tonight, she was following Poppy and Melissa on their rounds of the library. Melissa pushed a book-laden cart with a bum wheel from row to row, the wheel stuttering a rubbery sticking noise every few rotations, like the cart had something to say but couldn't spit it out. Poppy, on the other hand, had no such hesitation. There are only two kinds of women in those movies, she said, insipid beauties and crazy witches. That's it. Either you're sweet and submissive and enjoy singing to... I can't read this. Enjoy cleaning house and singing to dwarves and birds and rodents, in which case you require a man to come to your rescue when the shit hits the fan, or you're pathological with vanity and jealousy and bent on the destruction of your prettier counterparts. Every now and then, while she spoke, Poppy would select a book from the cart and without checking the title or author or call number, press it into a gap on one of the shelves. Aurora and Maleficent, she said, Snow White and the Evil Queen, Cinderella and her step-bitches, Ariel and the Big Fat Squid Woman. Ursula, Lenore said. Right, Ursula, Poppy said. The point is we're being brainwashed young. Helpless or horrible. Those are our choices according to Disney. Two of those princesses are so pathetic they snooze through their own movies waiting for a handsome prince to kiss them back to life. From somewhere behind the stacks, a peal of laughter fluttered up and away beneath the vaulted ceiling. Ransom Library resembled nothing so much as a cathedral. Weathered stone, arched windows, Gothic details. The only thing missing was a steeple. But Lenore had once heard Mr. Higgins remark that its closest architectural model was a prison, on the inside at any rate. 3 stories, each floor a gangway lined with shelves and overlooking the study area and the circulation desk on the ground level. Overhead, a pair of enormous chandeliers scattered shards of light. That laughter bubbled up again, the sound so bright and insubstantial it might have been coming from the chandeliers, but no one seemed to notice except Lenore. Ariel's not so bad, Melissa said. Give me a break, Poppy said. Ariel literally gives up her voice for the love of a man she's laid eyes on for like 15 seconds total. Her voice, hello. Lenore had been amazed, even proud, when Poppy stood up in front of the whole auditorium to challenge Vernon Plank. She couldn't recall every detail of their exchange, but she remembered the way his hand had gone to his heart like Poppy had hurt his feelings. I can assure you that we aren't ignoring anything, young lady. In fact, and I'm giving you a genuine sneak preview here, by employing the very latest in virtual reality technology, Disney Imagineers have created an underground railroad experience so revolutionary that it will really make you feel what it was like to be a slave. That's when Poppy called him a douche. And you couldn't blame her. Setting aside the lameness of the term Imagineers, what kind of person believed that you could recreate the experience of slavery in a theme park ride? What Lenore couldn't get her head around was why Poppy cared, or why she was pretending to care. This whole line of discussion felt a little rehearsed to Lenore, a little overstated. You forgot Belle, she said. She's not a princess. She's smart. She saves her dad. Belle, shoot, Poppy said. She might be the worst of all. Disney wants us to believe that Belle's all independent and strong, but she willingly becomes the prisoner of a monster. And then she falls in love with him. Really? Sounds like Stockholm Syndrome to me, but the movie still ends with a wedding. Lenore lifted a book from Melissa's cart. The cover was stained and battered, the title worn away. According to the checkout sheet, the book had been most recently in the possession of Astrid Lewis, a senior. Before Astrid, the book had last been checked out 8 years ago by someone called Reagan Pierce, and before that by Gretchen Beatty and Flora Stein and Agnes Key, all the way back to Stella Brighthouse, Lenore's grandmother. For almost half a century, her signature had lived in this book in its place upon these shelves, to be discovered or not by some girl or other, the book read and returned and checked out again, and so on until this moment, Lenore selecting just this book from Melissa's cart, while Poppy rambled about her gripe with Disney, a perfectly ordinary sequence of events capped by a coincidence that struck Lenore as profound. I'll stop right there.
That's a great passage.
I'm also too old to be squatting down like that for that amount of time. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get back up.
My kneecaps would have shot across the room had I tried that, but good for you. Well, have you all bought your books yet so you can see the cover of At Briarwood School for Girls?
Can I talk about the cover?
Yeah, I was going to say, usually authors don't have a whole lot of say in the covers, but you have a pretty personal relationship with the artist.
My wife designed this cover. Isn't it a gorgeous cover? And here's the coolest thing. So there are lots of cool things about this cover, but you see the little hidden Mickeys in the roses, the little Mickey Mouses? Isn't that cool? I know.
Haven't you heard from the IP department at Disney yet?
We have not gotten sued yet.
Yeah.
We have not gotten sued yet.
Yeah. Tell me about the title and at. You began the title with a preposition.
Well, the original title was The End of History, and the publisher was like, no, we're not. I don't think that's going to be the title. And so they wanted to call it Briarwood School for Girls, which was fine, but there's something about the preposition that makes it sound old-fashioned to me. I mean, it makes it sound like it's the title of a Thackeray novel or something, I don't know why it is, but I mean, that's as profound as it gets on the title. But the publisher didn't like the original title, and I didn't like it without the preposition. So I don't know, it dressed it up a little bit, made it seem a little more old-fashioned.
Michael Knight is wrapping up his book tour for At Briarwood School for Girls at Parnassus Books in Nashville this Wednesday, May 29th. Due to the Memorial Day holiday, things are pretty quiet here in terms of book and author events in Atlanta. One exception, this Thursday, E.L. James, the author behind the internationally best-selling 50 Shades of Grey series, will be at the Marcus Jewish Community Center of Atlanta. That's Thursday, May 30th. I am so pleased to be interviewing E.L. James at MJCCA, so please come out and see us. It promises to be a very fun night. We will be discussing her new novel, The Mister, and it is, as Cosmopolitan wrote, it's time to put aside 50 Shades and get into The Mister. So come see us this Thursday. Remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website. That's literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you like to get your podcast. Apple Podcast, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.